Dr. Kirsten Fisher is a professor of biology at Cal State LA, where she has been a faculty member since 2008. Her research program focuses on the ecology and evolution of mosses, particularly species in this genus Centrichia, which she mentioned before, that have diversified in arid environments in the northern hemisphere. Recent projects in the Fisher Lab have explored moss species composition in the Mojave Desert hypoliths, which are microhabitats under quartz pebbles. That's really cool, actually. Ecological genetics of the biocrust moss, Centrichia cananervis. Did I say that right? And patterns of hybridization in high elevation desert Centrichia species. Wow, that's quite a range for habitats for Centrichia. Centrichia. And for today, Dr. Kirsten Fisher will be presenting an introduction to the biology of bryophytes, the group of land plants that includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. She will provide examples from her own research that illustrate the unique ecology and evolution of these amazing little plants. And without further ado, take it away, Kirsten.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for such a nice introduction. I appreciate
Of
it very
course.
much. All right, let me go ahead and attempt to share here. All right, and like get in presentation mode real quick. There we go. Okay, so apologies, my title here is much shorter than the one I noticed that I provided originally in interest of abbreviating things here. So yes, today I'm really excited to come and provide you with an introduction to the bryophytes. As was previously mentioned, I'm coming from Cal State LA. And also I'm coming to you from the CNPS Bryophyte chapter. So I will be making some shameless plugs for you to consider. Oops. It looks like there's a hand. Someone have a question?
Oh, let's so if you guys have questions, let's save them to the end and then we'll have people raise their hands in order if they want
Okay,
to ask.
awesome. Thanks.
All right,
All
go ahead.
right, excellent. Yes, so I will also be shamelessly plugging the Bryophyte chapter occasionally throughout the talk. All right, oops, let's see if I can, there we go. Okay, so my professional work has focused on the bryophytes, and in particular the mosses. And so my students and I like to think of ourselves as sort of bryophyte evangelists, if you will. So I'm, I'm always really excited to come and share a little bit about the amazing diversity and just the coolness of this, I think, often overlooked group of plants. So I think this slide was just intended to show you sort of the properties of scale here, right? So you've probably noticed bryophytes before growing on your favorite vascular plant, but hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll be interested in looking a little closer and maybe checking out some of the details. So first off, what is a bryophyte? What are we talking about? And so as an evolutionary biologist, I'm going to sort of frame this first in an evolutionary context. So bryophytes are what we would refer to as green plants. In other words, they use chlorophyll to produce their own food through photosynthesis, and they fix carbon from the atmosphere as sort of their for saving for their energy source. And of course, uh, they give off oxygen in the process. So they have sort of green plants in general, right, have done a lot for our Earth's sort of biogeochemistry throughout time. And they are also in the group we refer to as land plants. And by land plants, I'm referring to the group along with the vascular plants that have a few different characteristics that I'll mention in just a second. So the vascular plants and the bryophytes together comprise the land plants. So you're probably more familiar with the vascular plants. So our friends, the seed plants, as well as the free sporing plants like ferns and lycophytes, which of course, in particular, the flowering plants definitely dominate the earth, right, in terms of biodiversity. But next up are the bryophytes in terms of biodiversity overall. I mean, nothing can compete with the flowering plants, but they're next up in terms of their overall diversity. So the liverworts are one group of bryophytes. And there's probably about, so we estimate around 7,000 recognized species worldwide. And as I'll show you in a little bit, they constitute a fairly heterogeneous group of plants in terms of their different forms that they take in their growth forms. And the mosses, which of course are my bias, I'm a moss person. The mosses are probably, again, around 14,000 species recognized worldwide. And finally, the hornworts, which are like the special weird uncle of the bryophyte groups. There's about 200 species, and they're very, and I'll show you a few more photographs of them in a sec, but they're an interesting group, and they have their own sort of unique morphology, particularly with respect to their sporophyte here, which looks like a horn. Can you guys see if I use the arrow on this, or is it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, okay, cool. Right on. I'll use it as my pointer then. That's great. Okay. Perfect. So together with the vascular plants, the bryophytes comprise a group, as I mentioned, known as the land plants. The land plants are also sometimes referred to as the embryophytes. And as the name suggests, right, these are like plants with embryos. So the green plants, the things that photosynthesize, include green algae, there's a certain group of green algae that are like the ancestors of all the land plants. But the embryophytes have a couple unique features that unite them. One of them is that they protect their newly developed, or developing, I should say, embryos, right, after fertilization within the maternal tissue. So a good example of that, right, is like within the ovules of flowering plants, the little new embryo is developing in there, and it's protected on the maternal plant. It's not sort of just exposed to the elements. And of course, eventually those develop into seeds in the seed plants. But all the land plants have this sort of feature of protecting their embryos as they're developing. Another feature that is common and shared by all of the land plants is this thing we call the alternation of generations. You may, if you took high school biology or college biology, have been assaulted with these life cycle diagrams back in the day. But the basic idea of the alternation of generations and why this is different than like the life cycle that we're familiar with as animals, right, is that there are alternating multicellular haploid and diploid states. And by haploid and diploid, I mean the number of chromosomes that they have in their genome, right? So we are diploid as adults, right? As like developed humans, we have two copies of each of our chromosomes. That's diploid. Haploid is what our gametes have, like our eggs and sperm only have one copy of those. But our eggs and sperm are only ever one cell, right? Our haploid stage is one cell. In the plants, there is a multicellular diploid stage like us, but there's also a multicellular haploid stage that makes the gametes. And that's sort of the difference there. So their life cycle alternates between these two stages of haploid and diploid, but both multicellular. Right. And this is just a little schematic to show you sort of a generalized bryophyte life cycle within that alternation of generations. So I'll try not to throw out too many crazy terms all the time, but just to name a few here that I may accidentally use too much. A gametophyte is the green leafy plant that we are familiar with seeing in the bryophytes, and that's the dominant part of the life cycle in bryophytes, and that is the haploid stage. So that is the one that only has one set of chromosomes in the cells. That's the haploid phase. So the little haploid gametophytes make gametes, eggs and sperm, and they undergo fertilization. If there's separate plants, that means that the sperm has to swim from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte to fertilize the egg. So they need freestanding water in their environment to do fertilization. And then if that fertilization event happens, the little fertilized egg will develop into the diploid phase of the life cycle, which is the sporophyte. Sporo meaning spore and phyte is plant, right? So this is the spore producing phase of the life cycle. And this would be the gamete producing phase of the life cycle here. So So in the sporophyte, in the capsule, which I'll show you more of in a sec, spores are produced, which then go out into the environment, germinate to produce more little green leafy haploid gametophytes. And so the life cycle continues. That is the alternation of generations in a nutshell. And in mosses, because you may be familiar with the term daiichi or monishi, which refers to sort of the unisexual or hermaphroditic state of flowering plants. So some flowering plants have in like unisexual plants, so just single sex. So things like, what's an example of a, like, so willows, for example, right? Like you either have a male tree or a female tree that produces either pollen or ovules or seed cone or seeds. In the bryophytes, that expression of the gametes is done, or sex expression, I'd say, is done in the haploid state. So we call it dioicous instead of dioecious. Just a weird oiky thing. And we also have monoicous instead of monoecious bryophytes. So if you ever see that term, that's what that refers to. All right. So one interesting trend in that alternation of generations that I just mentioned within the land plants is that there's been this sort of trend through land plant evolution to reduced reliance on water for fertilization. So as I showed you before, mosses and other bryophytes rely on sort of freestanding water in order for fertilization to happen. Through land plant evolution, we see like the reduced reliance on water with the evolution of seeds. And then there's also been a sort of reduced independence of the gametophyte stage of the life cycle. So through land plant evolution, if you go from like mosses to ferns and lycophytes to seed plants, you're seeing a reduction in the gametophyte stage, which becomes smaller and smaller. In the angiosperms, it's just basically reduced to a few cells inside the ovule. And then sort of an elaboration, if you will, of the diploid stage. So where in mosses, the sporophyte is kind of like a short-lived, ephemeral, and dependent on the gametophyte. As you get through land plant evolution, in ferns, the sporophyte is much larger, even though it still has free-living gametophytes. And then in the seed plants, of course, the sporophyte is like mostly all you see. All right, so I wanted to take the opportunity to sort of address something that, as an evolutionary biologist and a bryologist, someone who studies mosses, I just like to make the point that you don't have to look too far, right, to find references to mosses as primitive land plants or ancestral land plants or basal ancestors to the rest of the land plants and all that type of language, right? And so I'm just here to tell you that that is like not really accurate. And our old idea of land plant phylogeny, right, or that is like the evolutionary tree representing land plants, and this was based on our original analyses of things like morphological data and some of the early molecular analyses that we did based on DNA data. It showed this sort of pattern here, right? We call this like a grade where you have the liverworts. Each of these branching points is like an inferred common ancestor to the groups that arise from it, right? So there was like a common ancestor of Carophycean green algae with the rest of the plants. Then there was a common ancestor between the liverworts and what went on to become the rest of these things, right? And then the bryophytes, I'm sorry, the mosses, excuse me, shared a common ancestor with the rest. Then the hornworts, lycophytes, ferns, et cetera, right? So it's just kind of like gradual, you can this kind of lends itself to an interpretation of things sort of like gradually moving towards like the glorious angiosperms, right? In terms of like the pinnacle of evolution. You could put a person here too, right? A lot of trees have like a human in the spot of the angiosperm, right? If it's like an animal phylogeny. But more recent and not super recent, right? This was done back in 2018 and other sort of analyses that have followed have a different sort of what we call topology of this tree of land plant evolution, right? Where we actually have what we would call monophyletic or one single common ancestor of all the land plants here. I'm sorry, not all the land plants, all the bryophytes. This is the common ancestor of the land plants. This is one single common ancestor of all the bryophytes. Instead of being this like grade of things, each one slightly more closely related to the rest of the stuff, instead everything is equally related to each other. So that means there's a single common ancestor of all the bryophyte lineages and all the vascular plant lineages, instead of this like gradualist grade of things. And that's kind of significant in terms of how we interpret some of our traits in bryophytes. And in particular, I want to focus on water relations, which are super important in bryophytes. And again, all the bryophyte water relations, sort of prior to maybe 5 years ago, I guess, were always sort of presented as like the ancestral state in land plants, right? Like land plants started off like bryophytes and were, as I'm going to show you in a sec, very bryophyte-y, and then moved on to being like the vascular plants, right? And so what do we know about the vascular plants, right? In terms of their water relations. They have this waxy cuticle, right, on the surface of the plants that traps in water, of course, very important if you're terrestrial. They have xylem and phloem to conduct water throughout and food throughout the plant. And this is also lignified, right? A lot of these xylem elements here have lignin to make them stiff, which means that you can get good structural support and get pretty tall if you have this vasculature. If you contrast that with the water relations in the bryophytes are quite different, right? Whereas the vascular plants have internalized their water relations and trapped water inside their bodies, the bryophytes have a different sort of strategy, and they're what we call poikilohydric, which is like an ugly word. Sorry, but all it means, it's similar to like poikilothermy, if you're familiar with that in animals, like that would be like a lizard, right? Something that it can like equilibrate to its ambient, in this case, water or relative humidity, fairly quickly. Instead of fighting it by holding water into its body, it's just going to sort of go with the flow of the ambient water availability. So when the environment's wet, it will be hydrated. And as the environment around it dries out, so too does the plant. And that means that most of their water moves around their bodies, not internally through vessels and things like that, but actually externally, around sort of the external body of the bryophyte. And in fact, I didn't bring any, unfortunately, I don't have any cool videos, but if you ever want to check out some really cool videos, like look that up on YouTube. You can see like mosses rehydrating. It's really fascinating to see the movement of water from either the surface down through the stem and also up. They can wick water up from the substrate up through their external bodies as well, and go from something like this to something like this within the matter of like a couple seconds. They do it really quickly. What that means though is that they don't have any vasculature. Instead, they just move water externally and they don't have roots. And yeah, so different strategy, right? And as I mentioned, like originally we would think of this as sort of like probably what all land plants did when they first came to land. I should also mention that bryophyte surfaces are very interactive with their environment. So instead of having things like stomata to do gas exchange within the leaves are just one cell layer thick in most cases, sometimes a couple cell layers thick, but generally speaking, very thin. And so they just use diffusion to get things in and out of the leaves. They don't have like special structures or mechanisms to do that beyond diffusion. Sorry. So originally this was kind of thought of as maybe the primitive state of things. Sorry, one more thing. I forgot about desiccation tolerance. Another really important trait, which I'm super interested in. This is like a very cool physiological specialization that many bryophytes possess. And it's essentially the ability to lose all of your cellular water, or almost all of it, like down to relative humidity, down to very low relative humidity, and survive that and basically hang out in the state of suspended metabolism, suspended animation, if you will, until water is reintroduced, in which case you can then come back and recover quite quickly in some cases, rehydrate and start photosynthesizing again very quickly. So that is a special trait, and also something that is very common in the bryophytes. You can imagine if you're in a spot that isn't wet all the time, you're going to have to be able to tolerate drying out occasionally at least to survive that. Okay, there we go. So while those traits were all sort of thought of as potentially like the ancestral trait of all land plants, our new understanding of moss and other bryophytes' relationships to vascular plants, in other words, having one single common ancestor, suggests that instead of being like these sort of backwards things that never had it in the first place, some of these, like, we have vestigial features of some of these things, like we have stomata in the sporophytes of many of mosses, and also so in the capsules of mosses, and also in hornworts, we find stomatal structures. You also find things called hydroids and leptoids in the mosses, which I've shown a little photograph here from Jessica Budke. I don't know if I can see it in my, sorry, I can't see because I have something in front of it. But anyway, there's these little, there's an arrow, I think, pointing to like a thinner cell. That's a cross section through the midrib, if you will, of a moss leaflet. So it's kind of like a structural, like thicker part, like a midrib in the moss leaf. And you can see there's some little like cells in there that look like they're not like very specialized for water conduct or anything, but they look a little bit like tracheids to us in the sense that they're like dead at maturity and sort of thin-walled and open vessels basically in the moss leaves. So there's some traces of those. So it could be right that those things were actually present in the common ancestor of all land plants and then subsequently lost in the bryophytes where they were retained and elaborated in the vascular plants, which gives a very different, I think, sort of narrative about the state of bryophytes, right? Instead of being these sort of we often refer them as like the non-vascular plants, right? But instead they're more like physiologically specialized. They may have had vasculature. The lack of vasculature was often seen as a deficit, but in fact it may be an intentional specialization to a particular style of water relations, right? And I would just encourage you not to think of them as like basal or primitive land plants, but rather as very specialized land plants for a particular lifestyle. Okay, sorry, I said my piece. Let's move on and talk about mosses a little bit. Some of my favorite animals, of course, are tardigrades or moss piglets. They're super cute. There's a little frame here showing some of those guys. All right. So I already referred to, I think maybe in passing, to a few of the structures on mosses, but I just thought I would highlight the parts of a moss real quickly. So the sporophyte, again, the gametophyte is the little green leafy part, and we refer to the structures on the gametophyte, even though they're probably not, well, I think the jury's out as to whether or not they're actual leaves or not in terms of like homology, but they're very leaf-like. So we refer to them as the leaves and the branches and the stems of the gametophyte. That's the green part. And the sporophyte, which you can see there in sort of like the reddish color, has sort of three major structural components that we refer to. There's the stalk, which is the seta, and then the capsule, which is where the spores are produced via meiosis. And then at the opening of the capsule, at least while the sporophyte is developing, is this piece here. It looks kind of like a beak on these guys, and that's called the calyptra. So it's kind of like a little hat that sits on top of the sporophyte. And the calyptra is actually, it turns out, really important to the sporophyte's development. It comes from the maternal gametophyte plant. It's actually part of the old gametophyte. As the sporophyte grows out, it's a remnant that sticks on top of its head, sort of. As it grows up. And if you remove that, it actually messes up the development of the gametophyte. So the sporophyte. So it's getting messages and things. It's getting signals for its development from the maternal plant as it develops through that calyptra there. So it's important. All right. If we zoom in on a different species here, looking at its capsule, the opening of the capsule is called the operculum. And then around the operculum is a structure we refer to as the peristome. And you can almost even see in this picture here of this Rossulabrium, you can sort of see these little toothy toothy shapes. And we're going to zoom in here on the next slide, and you can see some electron scanning micrographs of these teeth. So the peristomes are very elaborate in some cases, and they're also important for diagnosing like major groups of mosses as well. So you get like the certain groups of mosses have like 2 rows of teeth, like I think this guy does here. There's outer teeth and inner teeth. Some of them only have 1 row of teeth, like this little guy here. Some of them are shredded. This is a centrichia. So this is like syn is like together and trichia is like hairs because they have these like really long baskety, extremely like that's the start of the peristome right there, right? These like huge, huge peristome teeth you can actually just see with your naked eye if you look at them, a sporophyte. So again, these are important sort of like taxonomically to diagnose the different groups of mosses. Probably they have a function in spore dispersal, in case anyone's curious. So they usually, or at least in some species, like the physidans here, these are bright red peristome teeth, by the way, they're really pretty. And they're sort of like hygroscopic, so they will move with varying moisture levels and sort of open and close based on ambient moisture, and probably has something to do with their spore dispersal process. All right. And within the mosses, one last thing that's kind of important in terms of moss taxonomy is that there's 2 major, I guess you would call them growth forms in mosses. There's kind of like the simple upright growth form, which is most of the things I've shown you so far, where you have a simple shoot, and then you have the sporophytes when they are produced, they terminate, right? They're sort of at the apex of that shoot, and they terminate the shoot. So just branching shoots with sporophytes at the tips, we call those acrocarpous mosses. There's another growth form, and you can see that really nicely here on this guy. This is one of the, this is an alzea, not a dendroalzea, but they're close. On these guys, the sporophytes are actually born, and you can see that on these little side branches of the main branch. So instead of being at the tip of the branch, they're on these little short side branches instead, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's actually kind of a diagnostic thing for mosses. And we call these pleurocarpous mosses when they grow in that form. And it turns out there's been some interesting work in the pleurocarps. Okay, full disclosure, I'm like, pleurocarps, they're like hard to tell. I have a really hard time identifying them, so I tend to ignore them. But it turns out they're like super, super diverse. So they're really important, particularly in the tropics. There's like huge, huge numbers of species in the tropics. They often are epiphytes, like if you see those like mosses dangling from tropical trees, it's a pleurocarp, probably a necera of some sort. And so this is sort of just showing the main sort of clade of where most moss diversity is happening here. And this is sort of a expanded version of the tree, just really sort of like mushed over here. But you can see these branches are scaled to sort of amount of change or potentially amount of time since that change happened. And so you can see this whole group here is the pleurocarps. So they comprise like a significant chunk of moss diversity, but they actually started evolving or originated not that long ago, probably after the rise of flowering plants. So they're fairly recent radiation, and they've really gone crazy, particularly in the tropics. Okay, but we definitely have them in California too. All right, so let's move to liverworts a little bit. I love this picture of an Astorella getting munched by a slug. They are delicious. I would say liverworts probably have more interesting secondary chemistry than mosses, and possibly that's because they're also more edible in general, more delicious to things. All right, so there's like 4 different kind of main growth, or they're not just main growth forms, they're also sort of main groups of liverworts. And so I just wanted to outline those here. The first group that's pretty diverse, probably, well, I don't know if it's the most, but anyway, it's an important group, and it's probably the one you're most likely to encounter here in Southern California, growing on soils and things, are the complex thalloid forms of liverworts. So these, you can kind of see it here in this conocephalum. They often have these dichotomous branches, and they grow fairly kind of flat and stuck to the substrate. And they have, this is a cross section through a thallus of one of these guys. So they have like a multicellular thalli with these little air pores and these little chambers with photosynthetic filaments inside the chambers. And you can kind of see that if you look at this. I'm sorry, I don't know how easily you can see it, but there's these like little like, it looks kind of like lizard skin or something. There's like these little speckles on here. Those are all those little pores that you're seeing on the surface of the thalloid liverwort. Um, so these guys are differentiated into sort of like an upper part of the thallus and lower part. So they have like a complex, as the name suggests, thalloid form. That's in contrast to the simple thalloid liverworts, which again, their thalli look more like moss leaves, basically, except that they're not, they're more sort of disorganized looking, I guess, if better, for lack of a better term, than a moss. And they have these very watery sporophytes. So they don't, and this is true of like all the liverworts, but particularly the simple thalloids, their sporophytes are very ephemeral and they don't last more than like, a day or two. They're very short-lived. They just kind of deliquesce. And so that's these guys. This is Fossambronia. I think this is the one that's behind me here in this photograph too. They're really cute. They look like little heads of romaine lettuce, but super tiny. Leafy liverworts are another form. Leafies are super, this is probably the most diverse group, again, mostly in the tropics, but we do have leafy liverworts here in California as well. And they have these two-ranked leaves along little stems. So these are easier to confuse with mosses if you're not careful, because they do kind of look mossy. They kind of converge with mosses in terms of their growth form. And they also have these capsules that are cool, and they open up into like 4 valves, or the valves, so they kind of open up into this cross shape. Oops. Oh, and I just had this fun photo, so I thought I'd throw it in. A lot of, or at least some leafy liverwort or leafies, and also some of the thalloids, but mostly leafies, have fluorescence. So they will fluoresce these really cool colors if they're exposed to UV light. So you can take a little UV light with you into the forest sometime and check it out. This is one that glows this really cool bright blue under UV. And then the final, this is really not a group, but a single species. maybe there's more than one thing and these guys, I'm actually not sure, but anyway, this is a spherocarpus, and these guys are shaped like a little urn, they almost look like tunicates to me, actually, if you're familiar with like marine inverts or like little sponges. They have a single pore at the top of their little vase or sac, and the little sporophyte sits inside there. It turns out that the way they do meiosis to produce their spores in that sporophyte is very orderly and very easy to see. And these are actually like the organism where meiosis was kind of like elucidated, because it's like really easy to see in them, as it turns out. Anyway, that's spherocarpus. That's like a weird form of liverwort. And they're actually kind of easy to find if you're ever in like a gross like strip mall parking lot. If there's like a little like bare dirt patch in the shade, that kind of situation, that's where you'll find these guys growing. All right, finally, the hornworts are really interesting. As I mentioned, there's not a ton of species diversity in this group, but they're really kind of odd and wacky. And of course, they're named for their weird looking horn-like sporophyte. Unlike the mosses that I showed you, which have very short-lived sporophytes, and the liverworts, which have even shorter-lived sporophytes, the sporophytes of the hornworts are actually indeterminate, meaning they just keep growing. They have indeterminate growth, and they're also much longer-lived. So there's just a schematic of they have a basal meristem, so kind of like a grass where they are dividing, and then they just keep pumping out more sporophyte throughout their lifetime. And my favorite thing about the hornworts is that they often associate with cyanobacteria. So like they have this really cool sort of blue-green cast, which makes them really easy. I mean, you could probably identify them anyway in the field because nothing looks like a hornwort, but they're very easy to spot because they're kind of this turquoise shade oftentimes when you see them, because they do have a lot of a lot of symbiotic cyanobacteria living inside of them. And they're kind of beautiful too. They have this interesting sort of jellyish look to them. They're pretty cool. Not super common in Southern California, but you can find them occasionally, especially in like higher elevations. All right. So speaking of finding things, places, where do bryophytes grow? Well, pretty much anywhere they want, I guess, is a good answer, right? They are in all terrestrial biomes. They even make it up into the upper intertidal, like sort of the splash zone in some places. So they're almost, unfortunately, not quite marine. I really would love it if there were marine mosses. Not quite, but almost. But they do occupy all types of terrestrial environments. And it's not just moist, shady places that never dry up, right? Or like the north side of trees. They actually do grow in very dry places as well as very wet places. And it's just all about that special trait of desiccation tolerance that I mentioned before. They are also aquatic, so they will grow in submerged in water or in the, sometimes in more sort of seasonally submerged areas, depending. There's records of moss of particular species of physidins that grows in the Amazon on freshwater sponges, which I think is really cool. And then there's this one that apparently, according to Gerald's Herbal from 1597, was growing on a skull. So there are also records of moss growing on bones and human bones as well. So all kinds of places. Pretty much anywhere that they are finding the right sort of pH and moisture levels and sort of temperature regime with respect to moisture levels, they can hang out. So there are, of course, in California, I mentioned before, I really like Dendroalzia alatina. That's the one that grows on oaks. Unfortunately, this picture gives me like the heebie-jeebies because there's so much poison oak in it. I should get a new photo. This makes me nervous looking at it. So very common in Northern California. It used to be found, Dendroalzia, there are records of it from down here as far as like the San Gabriels in like the San Dimas experimental forest, that kind of area up into Pasadena, but I haven't been able to find it. I don't think it exists down this far south anymore. Again, it could be a climate change thing. It might be too warm for it now. Grimmia is a really common species on rock in California. If you see these really beautiful, this is kind of a loose one, the Levigata, but there are some very tight little clumps as well that you can find of grimias. And then this is a Rixia, which are these really cool soil and also aquatic occasionally liverworts that you'll find, particularly in deserts. And Fontinalis is a common aquatic, fully submerged moss. As I mentioned before, many mosses live in niches that dry out entirely for the majority of the year. And so desiccation tolerant mosses, basically as they're drying down, are synthesizing all kinds of interesting things and packaging up their cellular components in such a way that they're able to rebuild things and repair themselves very quickly upon rewetting. So they rely on a repair mechanism for desiccation tolerance. There are some angiosperms that are also desiccation tolerant in their vegetative tissues, but they tend to be based on protecting themselves as they're drying so that they are okay through the drying process. Mosses dry so quickly that it's more about repairing themselves after they're rehydrated. So here's just some examples of those very dry places where we find mosses. That's my fingertip for scale. That's the little teensy tiny little teeny weeny moss clumps there. So very, very small, but there's mosses growing out here. This is in the Nevada and a kind of a creosote shrubland, very dry. Mosses in the desert and drylands are also really important components of biocrusts. So I just wanted to plug biocrusts as an important little like mini ecosystem in our arid parts of the world, but particularly here in California, in the Southwest. They are these associations. You can see there's some lichens in there as well. And there's also lots of bacteria. So these complex communities. And like the mosses, the organisms in the biocrust are also cryptobiotic, meaning they dry up and are desiccation tolerant and basically are in quiescence or suspended animation for most of the year until they get rehydrated. Um, and biocrusts are super important for dryland carbon capture, as well as just physical like protection and erosion control, kind of like regulating hydrological cycles, and also for nitrogen fixation. There's a lot of diazotrophs in the biocrust also that fix nitrogen, which is important. And I just wanted to mention the importance, it turns out, of mosses in these systems. So often mosses are sort of like the dominant or like physically dominant component of biocrusts. And this is just a fun figure from a paper I did with one of my colleagues at CSUN a few years ago. We looked at the bacterial communities associated with moss biocrusts in the Mojave Desert. And these are just one of the things that we found is that the bacteria associated with moss biocrusts, as opposed to other types of, biocrusts without mosses, is that they have lots and lots of genes and pathways associated with these ABC transporters, which are basically like these little transmembrane proteins with a little receptor site and a little pump on the inside that are specialized to binding some particular thing in the bacterial environment and helping it suck it in. So kind of like helping it quote unquote eat certain things in its environment. It turns out that when bacteria are living with mosses, they have all these different ABC transporters for all the things that mosses are probably giving off during their rehydration cycle, right? I mentioned that their desiccation tolerance is based on repair, but right at the beginning of that repair cycle, they just kind of like their cells are all over the place. They've cell membranes are bursting, they're fixing them. But in the meantime, um, all these important things for bacteria to eat are leaking out of the mosses. And this is a process that my friend Mandy Slate there, she's at Ohio State University now, she termed it the biotic pulse. And she and her coworkers actually demonstrated, this is in grasslands, but it's the same basic principle, right? That the bryophytes actually, the mosses that are growing on the soil in these systems, when they rehydrate, are actually providing these like pulses of nutrients into the ecosystem that actually has like functionally significant sort of effects on the ecosystem as a whole in terms of nutrient cycling. All right. How am I doing? Am I taking up too much time? So in terms of, I just wanted to sort of highlight another thing that I think is really cool about bryophytes and mosses is that they help us think about things at a different scale. And so I just wanted to point out how mosses are important indicator or can help us think about the environment that we're standing on in sort of a different scale. So I like to stress the importance of microhabitats for organisms that are small, like mosses. And often it's hard to appreciate if you're standing at, 5 feet or 6 feet above the ground. And it feels like this is like for example, a really hot environment. But for the mosses, all these mosses here, this is biocrust here in the Colorado Plateau. That's the Colorado River over here. These things are not hydrated, right? So even though it's hot out potentially or dry, they're fine because they are not metabolizing, they're not doing anything, they're just hanging out protected. And similarly, this is up in near Wrightwood, just a little bit down below Wrightwood in the San Gabriels on the Mojave side of things. And again, the mosses that are growing here are fairly protected during the dry part of the year. They're just quiescent. They're not, even though it feels hot to us, from the moss's perspective, it's not that big a deal. And if you look on the landscape, this is again in that same wash just below Wrightwood. You can see these this is all moss. There's this beautiful Trichicanna nervus growing on the surface. And there are these little quartz crystals kind of embedded here and there. And oh, there they are. And if you're bored and you happen to be flipping them over, sometimes you will notice that there's actually moss growing underneath the rocks. And so This is the surface. Again, the surface moss is this dark color here. And the moss growing underneath the quartz pebbles is actually quite a bit greener. It turns out, a couple slides ago, I showed you my former student, and now she's a professor in her own right at San Francisco State, Jenna Ekwalo. She's did a lot of interesting work demonstrating that UV actually has quite an effect on the pigmentation in these mosses. So when you block out the UV with quartz, you end up with much greener mosses than when they're exposed to UV out on the surface. Anyway, we've done some work in my lab looking at species composition under these hypoliths, as opposed to the mosses on the surface right next, adjacent to the hyperliths. And it turns out there's actually a difference in terms of the species composition. So you find different species and different sort of abundances under the quartz crystals or in the hypoliths as opposed to on the surface. And we were curious as to why. So this is Jenna again deploying some little micro sensors out at one of our study sites. We did this a couple places. We buried these little data loggers under the hypoliths next to the moss and also on the surface. And just over the course of several months, tracked the relative humidity and temperature cycles throughout the day and the night in those places. And it turns out, in a nutshell, this is a lot of numbers, but the basic message is that hypoliths buffer the organisms that are growing underneath them from the prevailing sort of environmental stressors. So hypoliths at their very hottest are less hot than the surface, and at their very coldest are less cold than the surface, and that their mean sort of relative humidity is much higher than it is on the surface, and there's less of a fluctuation. So there's the relative high is actually a little less high because it doesn't quite get the same dew effect at the night in the nighttime, but the relative low humidity, excuse me, is much higher under the hypoliths than it is on the surface. So they stay moister for a longer period of time. All right, and with that, I think I'm probably over time, so I'm going to be quiet and say thank you. Thanks so much to my host on the Orange County chapter and the South Coast chapter, and then Jenna, Rachel, and Paul Wilson for their data and also many photographs that I used in this, or figures that I used in this talk, and a couple funding sources. And I just wanted to point out, this is not the CNPS Bryophyte chapter, but you could put on a moss suit if you wanted to and join us. I have the website here. You can come check out our field trips, how to join. Like I said, you can still stay in your primary chapter and still join the Bryophyte chapter if you would like. It's awesome. We are always happy to have more members, and we do enjoy sharing bryophytes with everybody. So I hope you will join us. And if there's time for questions, I would love to take some.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have time for questions. If we're wearing that at Sobe Free, I'm gonna register right now.
I cannot promise you a moss suit, but that's
Oh
a
my gosh.
yeah. So it turns out. So this is in Bejar, Spain. I think it's a place in Spain, and it's part of some kind of cultural ritual that because it's like a historical thing. But apparently they reuse these moss suits every year, so it's kind of
Wow.
sustainable. They have to like. It kind of looks like they're reused too. They look a little ratty. So let's put them
This
back
sounds
together.
good.
So, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'll start reading some of the questions that are in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask Kirsten themselves, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on your name and you can unmute. But for the first question, oh, this is a good one. This is one that I had as well from Edith R. Most vascular plants have symbiotic relationships with fungi. Do bryophytes have relationships with fungi as well?
Yes. Yeah, totally. In fact, it's a little hard to tease out from the fossil record because it's just bryophytes and probably fungi also don't fossilize particularly well, but we have a pretty strong inkling, right, that like mycorrhizal fungal or some kind of fungal associations probably help to facilitate sort of like early bryophytes on land and probably all sort of land plants as they, early land plants probably had associations with fungi and those have persisted. But yeah, there's been some really cool work. One of my colleagues, Kirsten She's out on the East Coast, but one of her students looked at the fungal loop, basically like connections between I think it was creosote bush and like some of the mosses in the biocrust and how they were transporting carbon in that system. So yes, there's definitely fungal connections in the bryophyte world for
Okay,
sure.
great.
Yeah,
So,
despite not having roots, so they must like they're making connections with the gametophytes in some other way, I guess.
oh wow, okay. I was gonna ask that. I was like, they don't have roots. How does this work?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question.
Um,
So now I need to go look that up. I'm not sure. It must attach to the stems,
yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And do you know if it's like arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi or are they like ectomycorrhizal or is it something totally different?
I don't know. Again,
Interesting.
need to
Okay.
look. I'm not sure if we know that much. I know we've looked at this was like the work I'm referring to was looking at sort of like the transport of carbon isotopes. So we know it was
Mm.
happening through
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
but and I don't know if we know a lot about like the taxa that are doing it though. That's a good question.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Coming soon to a journal near you.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully. Okay, Amy Rose is asking, how long can bryophytes survive without hydration?
A long time. So I think some of the longest records, and I could be wrong about, well, I guess there's a couple different ways of thinking about this. They stay viable. In other words, like their cells are like potentially can regenerate into new plants. Like most plants, like I have this like totipotency, we call it, right? Like you can take any plant cell and like force it to form a new plant through like culture. Bryophytes are really good at that. And so I know that there's cases where like glaciers have retreated, basically exposing old bryophytes that were once on the surface, like, thousands of years ago, and they've been able to coax those into producing a new moss.
Oh,
But
wow.
that is just like from a cell level, but the actual bryophyte itself surviving desiccation, not just freezing, but like desiccation. We have herbarium specimens that are like, upwards of I can't remember what the longest time was. Now I'm thinking it might have been close to 100 years, 50 to 100 in that range, right? Like you can rehydrate them sometimes and eke them back to life from the same plant. And
Wow.
sometimes, yeah. I think it was 50. Like that's the actual stem still being alive.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Jean Lapowski is asking, so this presentation is much better than my biology book. Would it be possible to get a copy of the slides? I will say that the meeting will be posted on YouTube, so you can rewatch it as to your heart's content.
Yeah, if there's any particular slides you're interested in, yeah, just shoot me. I don't know if I put my email contact in here, but I can throw it in the chat if you wanted to shoot me an email.
Okay, great.
That.
Brent is asking, Brent Morgan, in the UV light, why are only some parts glowing?
Right. I'm sorry. I sort of showed you a confusing shot there. So that was like a mixed bag of things. So there were some like mosses growing there as well as the liverwort. And so the things that are fluorescing are the liverwort. So
Um,
there were other friends like growing alongside it that weren't fluorescent. Yeah, I think that's why. Yeah.
Um, your photo, one of these photos that you showed kind of described this, but do lichens and mosses hang out together? This is from Marcia.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they love to hang out together. So yes, in short, yes. On rocks, right? And in the biocrust that I was showing, you often get them both too. And then also, oh, there's the chat. Okay. Yes, absolutely. And on trees and things like the epiphytes, you'll find mosses and lichens growing together all the time.
Okay. And for the UV luminescence that you were just talking about, is there any function to that? Sue Woodward is
Um,
asking.
not to my knowledge. I suspect and this is just speculation, but um, liverworts they have these things called oil bodies in their cells. And so I'm guessing that might cause the light to refract in kind of strange ways sometimes. Yeah,
Okay.
their cells are like loaded with these oil bodies oftentimes. And again, I don't know what the function of those is either, but that's probably what causes the fluorescence.
Darlene Ward is asking, um, Is dry moss highly flammable on oak branches, and is that a concern for fire danger?
Um, that is a good question. I mean, I would suspect it would be flammable because it's dry. Um, at the same time, I don't know if it would like burn long and hard enough to cause the tree itself to catch on fire if the tree is relatively hydrated, right? Because they're only on the bark and they're not, um, I think at least in places where in California, where we get tree mosses, right, they're not so abundant as to create like what I would consider like a major fuel source on the tree. In the Pacific Northwest, you get these huge carpets of mosses and things growing on, but they're always wet. That's why you have huge carpets, right? So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I suspect it's probably like they would fizzle, but maybe not. Um, Yeah, not be
Okay.
like a major source of ignition. I don't know though. That's a good question.
Do bryophytes that grow on plants, for instance, tree barks, branches, and branches, have an effect on the vascular plants themselves? Like, do they degrade any of the bark? Or is there any sort of nutrient exchange happening?
Um, that's let's see. So, long term they may have a net effect if they're like trapping water next to the bark, for example, right? But I haven't really read anything about them having a detrimental effect. And in fact, places like the Pacific Northwest that I just mentioned, Nalini Nadkarni up there has done some really cool work looking at these bryophyte mats on the trees, right? And they actually create such a large amount of organic matter, like through decomposition and capturing nutrients and stuff on the branches, that the trees actually grow roots they grow adventitious roots essentially from their branches into the mats to get like
Oh, wow.
to take advantage of that soil. So I don't think they're even in places like the Pacific Northwest where they're like really like heavy laden with them, right? I think they actually might be beneficial in the sense that they're providing potentially anyway, like another nutrient source to the tree, like up in the canopy. Um, that's like super important in like the tropics, right? Where the nutrients in the soil are actually really low. Like the soil is terrible. So having like a special like your own personal soil deposit up in your branches that you can tap into for nutrients is probably a good thing.
Okay, cool. All right, two more questions. From Clint Kellner. Do some mosses outcompete lichens, and do some lichens outcompete mosses?
I don't know. This is just anecdotal, but I would say probably yes. Um, and that's just based on, I don't know if it's competition, but they definitely like in the desert where I work, they definitely like replace each other. So, um, in some situations, lichens prevail on the soil surface, right? You find biocrust with lots of lichens and no moss. And then the opposite is true. Sometimes you find lots of moss, but very few lichens. Um, and I suspect they're just better at competing for space given a certain, certain environmental parameters. I think the lichens are probably more tolerant of heat and exposure to sun and like even less moisture than the mosses are. So like on south facing slopes, like soil slopes in the desert, you'll often find like lichen biocrust, but no moss there. And then the opposite on the north facing, you find like moss ones, but maybe they're outcompeting the lichens in those conditions. So
Oh, no. Okay.
yeah, I do think they probably compete.
Okay.
But it's modulated by sort of the environment, pretty sure.
Oh wait, there's two more. Okay, Edith R. I'm sorry I missed your question. When I see a clump of species of bryophytes, am I seeing an individual plant or a cluster of genetically distinct individuals?
That's such a good question. That's like one of the questions that I'm super fascinated by. It turns out like both those things. It's usually the same genotype or the same individual, but mosses also like to grow next to each other. So you can find like genetically distinct individuals of the same species that are just growing in the same or multiple ones, right? And their degree of clonality, I'd say, probably has at least something to do with the environment. So in the desert, it's much more common to find these very extensive clones of the same genotype, just because someone was good at getting established and actually managed to do it, and now they're sort of like there, right? Whereas I think when things are more permissive, you may get multiple spores that are able to germinate and grow with each other if, if there's a little more moisture and things are a little less stressful. So it definitely depends, but even in the desert, we sometimes will find different genetic individuals growing right up next to each other.
Right.
Um,
All
that
right,
will
one more question. Ron Vanderhoff is asking, are air pollutants a serious threat to bryophytes in places like the LA basin?
it definitely has an impact. Yeah. So, um, yes, I don't know if it's well, I guess it was a threat because you don't find, for example, a lot of diversity of like epiphytic bryophytes on trees in LA. It's pretty hard to find them. Like you'll find bryophytes on soils sometimes, right? And as you start to get up higher and higher elevations, like maybe over like sort of the inversion layer, all the fog sits, you start to find more things like potentially anyway on trees or bark. But I think epiphytes, like epiphytic bryophytes in particular, and lichens are very sensitive to pollutants. I don't know why I just got into lichens because that wasn't the question, but but there are a few, and this isn't really as true there are a few weedy mosses that you find everywhere, right? Like no matter where you are, and they're pretty tolerant of pollution, but a lot of the things that grow on trees are less tolerant, or other things too, but especially you notice that they're just not very present on trees, and that could be partially just due to the lack of moisture, but I think it has a lot to do with air pollution as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And to be respectful of everybody's time, I think we're going to end the meeting here. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Fisher. Her email is in the chat. And I want to say I've been to workshops on bryophytes before, but I feel like this presentation really blew me away. So thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
presenting.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for letting me talk about bryophytes
Of course,
for a
yes.
whole hour. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for listening.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.